Hello, hello. I'm Punar Givanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Sarah Kirwan. Sarah is a global disability inclusion strategist with 15 years of experience providing operations support, technical assistance, and awareness training in workplace and healthcare settings. As the founder of iLevel, a disability-in certified, disability-owned business enterprise, she empowers women with chronic conditions through coaching and mentoring programs and peer-led support groups. Sarah is a volunteer mentor for the National MS Society Emerging Leaders Alliance and an Ability 360 adaptive sports program coach. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Sarah Kirwan, who is the founder of iLevel Communications. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. This was very much in the making for a while. So I'm very much looking forward to this
Oh,
conversation. And I
me
can't
too.
wait for our audience to be listening to this conversation as well. So welcome again.
Thank you.
Can you please tell me and our audience more about yourself and how you came to where you are today?
Yes. So again, thank you for having me. As you said, I am the founder and CEO of iLevel Communications, or iLevel. iLevel is a certified disability and women-owned business. I live with disabilities myself. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS, which is a chronic progressive neurological and autoimmune disease. I also have a very rare inner ear and vestibular disease that is called a mouthful. But it is also called superior. It's not really called a mouthful. It just is one.
I
Um,
honestly thought for a second. I was like, I'm going to look into it, taking notes.
it's called superior semicircular canal dehiscence, or SSCD, and it affects just 1 to 2% of the world's population. The interesting thing about this and why I'm sharing this with you is that my MS took about 8 months to diagnose. However, my SSCD almost took almost a decade. So during that time, I was forced to leave the traditional workforce because I couldn't get the supports I needed to continue working, like flexible work hours or work from home opportunities or um, a private office, things like that. And you'll hear me say this quite a bit, and I've said this repeatedly. I went from being this up and coming hospital administrator to literally being unemployed and uninsured, sleeping in friends' spare bedrooms. So that really got me thinking about just equity on a deeper basis and the impact of equity and the design um, of everything in the world. Like we were saying before, everything is about design, whether it be a policy, a procedure, a guideline, a physical location, virtual location. And I started thinking about these things and I thought, okay, I'm the most well positioned in the United States to get the healthcare that I need. So when we think about accessibility and equity, I'm white. English is my first language. I have a bachelor's degree in communications and a master's degree in public administration. I also worked in Congress on healthcare reform legislation, and I was an administrator at a world-renowned physical rehabilitation hospital. So if it took me almost 10 years to get a diagnosis and treatment, I just started to imagine what would that look like for a woman of color who's experiencing all of these multiple marginalizations simultaneously. And really, this inequity is why I founded iLevel. And the work that I do is about helping people understand that when we look at the world and look at our work and our products from a universal design perspective, we can design things that fit for everyone. So accessibility isn't just about people with disabilities. It's not just about design of physical locations, but how do we design a structure and redesign a structure that works for everyone?
Oh my God, I have so many There's so many things to reflect on, and what a like fascinating journey in what led you to this. And I think in itself, it shows kind of the importance of engaging and creating and strategizing and designing with people with the lived experiences too, because that is the journey you went through. You can't go to college for that, right? And you can't never really empathize fully. You can try to understand, but this kind of perspective and effort to raise awareness and even train individuals can only really come from someone like you. So I'm curious to hear, and obviously you had your own personal experiences, but when you founded iLevel and started working with, I'm assuming other companies, maybe like institutions, um, what are some of the main observations you had? Did you find them um, kind of quite common and chronic, regardless of the industry or even maybe where they are? Or were they really, did they also have their own like unique challenges?
I would say, from a high level view, there are themes,
Mm,
barrier themes, and they're also underneath these barriers, there are more specific um, items that are specific to a company, but there are the themes that really I have found in for-profits, nonprofits, and government agencies.
mm,
Um, and I'll touch on five of these that I identified from a high level overview, and then I can go back into depth on some of these. But the one thing that I want to talk about is how we look at disability from um, a theoretical model of disability. So when we think about disability, we think about a medical diagnosis. So I'm disabled because I have SSCD, which I didn't share earlier, but it causes me to hear my own internal organs at a amplified volume level that really drowns out any noise around me.
mm,
And so I ended up having brain surgery for that. So when we think about a medical model, people think, what's your diagnosis? What's your medical history? That's the disability. When we think about this and move more into a universal design, and we think about this from a social model perspective, the social model says, no, it's not my disabilities that are disabling me. It's the design of the world around us that's disabling, because none of it was created with us in mind or at the table. And so the first part is the high level issue is that we're thinking we need to change perspectives in our conversations around disability, and really move from that medical model into that social model mindset of, no, it's the environment. And so how do we change the environment through universal design, whether it be the structure of the business, or whether it be the policies that are in place, or the physical structure? It doesn't matter, because it's going to be applicable to all of those areas when we look through the lens of universal design. So inaccessibility is really the issue, right? Disabled by design is really, I think, what's happening. Um, One of the things I did want to share, which you might love this example. I was flying out of LAX, and all the parking structures are required to have a ramp. Well, they all have them on the bottom level. And so if you aren't able to park in accessible parking and you have to go up to like the fifth level, there are only stairs to get to the elevator. And so there's no ramp so that you can actually get to the elevator and go down the stairs. The only ramp that exists is on the first level. And so sometimes I think we take the ADA and we do the bare minimum with the ADA without stepping back to say, okay, well, let's look at different scenarios. If someone doesn't have access to an accessible parking space, how are they going to get down here from level 4 or whatnot? Um, so that's kind of number one, and I'll go through the other four. But I think really we're looking at change in administration in the United States is having a big impact. Lack of understanding of universal design, which I'm kind of touching on. The bias in AI, with which another one of your guests also spoke about. It was fascinating and frightening. And we're taking a theoretical as opposed to a practical approach to this work. Those are my top five.
I mean, yeah, I would argue with, I would definitely also argue that these could be very much, have their own ways of like symptoms in companies and industries. I think like with the example that you're giving, when it's either checking the box or like creative thought about a dress in its own silo, or it's a total afterthought. It's just painfully obvious, right? Like, so, and it doesn't also work. And if anything, it's maybe even more frustrating because the illusion is like, oh, maybe it is accessible. And then you go and then it's actually really not. So maybe knowing if it's inaccessible, you won't go in the first place. So maybe that's even better, right? So like if, and this kind of sometimes what I see paralyzes brands or companies in a way, then they're kind of like, well, we can't do it all at once, right? Like in the end, you can't achieve a universal design immediately too, right? Especially when you're in the business of renovation of all of these things, right? Like whether they're physical or digital. Um, but I think what we don't talk about enough is the process. Like obviously universal design, like even the fact that we could one day aim to be universal calls for iteration of inclusive design, right? So maybe we should be talking more about like designing a roadmap instead of an outcome. And really, and as a, communication expert too, I would love to get your thoughts on really just communicating this to the community, right? Like, I think there is this really desire to impress or be on board already. So when something is launched, sometimes like it's designed for all, but we know it's not. And so that comes inauthentic. And or there's the fear of saying the wrong thing and therefore not doing anything, which is even worse. And so, what would like, where do we need to get and what do we need to change about corporate communications or like government agency or nonprofit, right? Facing the public. Because I think, like, in this space or other spaces, what I see when there is like real community engagement, like when it's authentic co-creation,
Mhm.
people understand when things are not feasible or viable, or they try to also work with you for workarounds, right? Like people are not like there to just blame you for things. But I don't understand why the communications aspect is not up to a level that really is just like resonating with people, even though we have so many case studies where that may be one of the main reasons why initiatives are failing. So, as a communications expert, I would love your thoughts on
Oh my gosh. Yes. And I also have been in communications for a long time. And so, uh, really, I was assistant hospital administrator at a large, world-renowned physical rehab hospital. It's called Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center. And one of the things as the public information officer that I learned was, it was like my initial intro to communications, but plain language. Just writing things that everyone can understand. And so when we go back, and this is something I see in corporations, and I'm going to say across the board, really. Right now, it's very prominent in corporations is that there's a lack of communication, like strategic marketing communication that's aligning the internal and external messaging. And so what's
Mhm.
happening is that it's frustrating for individuals internally when the focus is always on external clients. And
Mhm.
it's almost like, and I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, it's almost like a one or the other that people are doing.
So
But the
true.
necessity is to do them at the same time. because the only way that you can get buy-in to bring everyone up externally and internally is to align those messages.
Mm.
And that is not
Oh,
happening at all.
so cool.
I think
Yeah,
it's
so
also
true.
like, oh, I'm sorry, I did not mean to interrupt.
No, 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 no. I was just like reflecting it in terms of like also, when we say, like, for example, human-centered design is a very popular term, but then it's somehow turned into customer-centered design, where you're like, but like humans are also involved in the process of generating it. So maybe, when we say humans, consider all the humans involved. And I think, yeah, and I never thought about it from communications aspect too, but it's so true.
It's and it's incredible because there's almost this fear to share out what they're doing internally and externally for fear of if this doesn't work, I'm going to look bad.
Mm,
And I and realistically, what we need to shift from is how do we support the community and bring everyone on this journey with us, right? Because it is, like you said
right.
previously, it's slow moving change. It's baby steps. It's incremental. When I was younger, I was like, oh, incremental is the worst. Now, having been in the industry for so long, I'm like, I'll take it, right? If
Yeah,
I can impact or change one person's perception, I'll take it,
exactly.
because
Yeah.
that's how we start that conversation. And so so there's the overall company communication, but there's also a big, big lack of communication within when it comes to interpersonal.
Mm.
And that fear of having a conversation about disability, period, because you're scared to make a mistake or you're scared to put your business or yourself at risk of liability or um, you know
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
doing it right or providing the correct accommodations or so there's this fear and so no one's having the conversation because the disabled person's always like I'm fearful of telling you about my disabilities and then the other person is fearful of how do I respond to that and how do I move forward with that knowledge. And so a lot of the work that we do is how do we debristle almost the conversations between people? How do we recognize that for me as a person with disability, that there's as much onus on me as my manager or supervisor to be able to communicate my needs and what I'm experiencing. And sometimes that's difficult because for me, I don't always know what accommodation I would need. And
Mm.
so, what I share with people in my coaching and in our training workshops is how do we start that conversation without the experiences that we've had before, right? Because on my end, as the person with the disability, I've had to fight for everything just to get to where I am. And so I'm already probably going in a little bristled up, a little bit
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
frustrated, and expecting that I'm going to have to defend myself. And then the other person is coming in like, well, I don't really know, what this disease is or what this disability is or how do I support her. So if we remove all of that, we just sit down and say, what's the problem that you're facing right now? For me, it could be I need to take a nap or a break at 3 p.m. for an hour. So my work hours vary, or I may need to have every other Friday off. But let's look at the root of the issue that we're trying to address, which would be chronic fatigue in my
Yeah.
situation. And let's talk about a win for the company and a win for the individual. And how do we design a system where we don't go into it immediately bristled up and frustrated and bringing all this baggage with us?
Yeah. And so true. And like changing kind of the perception or bias, which is maybe so ingrained because of capitalist culture, is like, oh, less hours. Oh, like a Friday. Oh, that means like less work. So therefore compensated accordingly. And that frustrates me because I also observe a lot of inefficient 5 day working that really can boil down to 3 day working, like in my opinion.
Yep.
And technically, those individuals will be able-bodied with no chronic conditions. And also, what I think in my experience in co-design projects with people with disabilities, when you start off, you're like 50% ahead of the game already, just because of the deeper level insights you gain. And no way you would have gained those by yourself, right? Or even like research, right? Where am I going to research? There's not enough research even in this space. So I think that's kind of like we need to kind of like debunk that myth already, where like, oh, that will translate into less work. No, right? And like maybe less meetings and talking, but that doesn't necessarily mean less action or output. And I think we first should like address that. And I'm curious to hear what you think in terms of in and I know like I see the value of what you bring because it's so high touch and it's both like a trainer, but also someone with a lived experience. So when companies work with you, it's actually like a co-design, like, okay, let's work through this together. And then you're already there with like, ask me anything attitude, which kind of really helps. But I've seen sometimes in bigger corporations, maybe also, maybe there might be a separate department for DEI, maybe like for disability services. Um, and I've seen extremely productive, extremely collaborative DEI departments or disability service departments. And I've seen um, also DEI departments where they it functions a little bit like angry activism. So then you kind of become this department that nobody wants to collaborate with you and or is afraid of you. And then we see what DI departments get shut down. Like I was zero shocked when that happened, and not because I don't think the individuals need to exist in the corporation. In fact, we need all opinions, right? But maybe it was the organizational structure that failed them, right? Like, should they be a separate department or should they be in every department is one question that I kept thinking of. Or, is it more like having kind of a common groundwork or house rules or guidelines, whatever it is, to like approach these? Because then you don't want to be scolded at for like doing something wrong. So I'm curious, and I don't want to definitely stereotype or lump sum, the entire profession or departments. I've worked with extremely amazing people as well in this space, but I've seen others too. And I'm curious your thoughts on that too, their role in kind of enabling organizations and what could have been a better setup so we don't like the department itself doesn't become infamous, especially in the business leadership world.
Oh, that is those are interesting questions, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. I th Right now there's an inefficiency of the work, and that
Mm,
really goes back to communications and how are we interacting with the individuals in the organization who already have disabilities? Is that through an employee resource group or a business resource group? And if it is, how are we empowering those members of the group to bring forward initiatives that will help all people with disabilities, whether they be chronic
yeah,
illnesses, mental health struggles, things like that. Um, but the issue is when we get into a disconnect between like frontline and
mm,
leaders and
mm,
and that throughway for communications and conversation. And so I've have seen where a DEI department becomes ineffective because there aren't opportunities to move forward the initiatives without
yeah,
an executive or C-suite level champion. And
yeah.
so there's all these great things going on here, but they're not getting up to leadership for that support and to push those initiatives through. Now, going
Mm.
to your question of an angry group of people, I think it's so funny because, yeah, people with disabilities are angry, right? I mean, and every right, like rightfully so, people are
Yeah.
angry. The issue is that if we stay angry, we can't step back again. And I always say that, like, what's the bigger picture view?
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes, maybe not even sometimes, we need to change our perception from a me culture to a
Mm.
we culture, to
Yeah.
how does this impact the community? So oftentimes people will come into this work, because of something they've experienced, but
Yeah.
how do we go from my experience to how does this help, or how can I make an impact for the entire community? And so sometimes there's also that perception shift that needs to happen in the employee resource and business group so that they can be effective. But there are
Yeah.
specific supports that have to be there in order to do that. Like, for example, for me, one of um, one of the things I'm most proud of and grateful for is that I have a vantage point from being a disabled woman and being an administrator and understanding business.
Hmm.
Um, and what has taken me quite a while is to align this angry part of me, um, that it took a decade for me to get a diagnosis and treatment, and my anger at how inaccessible the system was, for me. And aligning that with the young, excited hospital administrator that was like, it's the system. The providers and the patients are in this system where they're pitted against one another, really.
Mm.
And the first line of access is the office managers, but they've never been trained on how to even interact with patients or people with disabilities. And so I think that for me, if I look at this from um, my angry side that was angry for a long time, I've really had to work to align those two, to have them both balance my heart and my mind in order
Yeah.
to have create a win-win for individuals and for companies, or for providers and patients. And so, yeah, that's how I feel about that.
But that's so
And that's
wonderful for
my
you to
experience.
share,
Yeah.
though, because, like, I think I'm wondering if there's enough open conversation around this too. Because when you said communications, and I'm like, oh my God, as I'm talking to you, I'm like, everything's communication now.
Everything.
Because, like, what you're saying also, that journey, right? Like, it's an internal communication to yourself. Like, in the end, what we're asking people to compartmentalize something that they can't really compartmentalize is their life, and they've been going through it. And of course, they're angry, right? But anger can be very constructive as well. If you channel it right in the right like doses and like mediums or styles. But
Hmm.
then for that readiness to happen, we can't expect people for that to be also be like overnight, right? Like, and then that calls for a lot of internal communication. We can call it therapy, whatever it is, but it calls for talking to
Yeah.
yourself first. Like, are you even ready? Like, we see this in co-creation work too sometimes, and this is not even, it may not have to be about disability. It can be about something else where a person
Hmm.
may not just be ready to be like thinking about the future because it's so present, right? Or it's just the impact is so much in the moment. And so, when does that readiness happen, and how do we even support? And going back to what you said around ERGs, like, can they really be that support, guidance, and network and the community that people need to kind of go through that as well? So there, it's not only because that anger in the end is the most harmful to our individual selves, right? Regardless of what kind of human we are. There's a saying in Turkish, I don't know even how to translate this in English, but it's like a very sharp vinegar is only damaging to its bottle or something like that.
Interesting.
Like, you only damage your own packaging if you're very like hot for
Yes,
it. Yeah. So it's the saying like that. I need to check if there's a better translation, but it vaguely translates to that.
which
Um,
is true.
so, but then that's the journey for everyone to think about, right? And how do you also stay, like, keep calm and carry on in a way? Like, even I sometimes find myself extremely triggered because I know so many, like, talented, amazing people that I work with in the community. And when there's like a blanket statement about, disability, I get frustrated. And then I reflect on now, like communicating this to students. Like one time I actually snapped at a person, and my students were like, "Oh, you showed them, they shouldn't talk like that." I'm like, "No, no, no. Actually, I lost that person forever now. Like that person is never gonna speak up again." So I should
Yeah,
have actually kept my calm in that moment. But yeah, I'm like, it's a personal journey and then a personal like internal communication with yourself to then internal in the organization. Like, how do we communicate these things with your peers, with your superiors? And what you said around like no representation in senior leadership or the boardroom even, right? Like even when there's a chief DEI officer, like do they really have presence in the boardroom? Um, or are they like, do they have equal amount of budget? Like there's so many ways, and we see the same symptom in how like design sometimes is homeless in big corporations. Like they don't have a C-suite to report to, like a chief design officer. They're not represented in the boardroom, and sometimes they get eliminated for that reason too. Designers report to, I don't know, CTOs sometimes to someone else, and you see the impacts of that and what it does to design. And I think, like, how do we, I guess, evolve this journey of how we should be communicating around this so that our entire approach around this changes to we need representation at all levels to
hmm
really be able to talk about inclusion um,
absolutely,
altogether. Yeah, so everything is
absolutely.
communication. Can we say that?
Everything is communication. It really, it
Very
truly
human.
is. And it
Yeah.
is human. And your question about where does it live, that's one that has been coming up quite often, especially as at least in the United States, for people who are looking at the incoming administration next year and really looking at how
Mhm.
are we messaging this work? What what words are we using? We've seen a lot of corporations really pull back on the initiatives, which has what I've experienced in my professional experience is that it's causing a lot of churn at the
Mm,
C-suite and executive levels, and
yeah.
maybe some cutting of DEI departments, and then trying to figure out where does this live? Does it live under HR? Does it live
Yeah.
under its own umbrella? Does it report into someone? And I
Yeah.
was thinking back to, again, when I was a really young administrator, I was under the chief operations officer with direct report and to C-suite level. And I was part of like the executive leadership council. That's
Yeah.
where someone needs to sit. They have to sit in one of those areas or on the board to actually move that needle. It has to happen.
Mhm.
Otherwise, if it's under HR, there's an inherent lack of trust from employees. Why would I tell
Oh,
HR that I'm disabled? Why would I share that I have ADHD or I was just
so
diagnosed
true.
as autistic or, whatever it may be? Why would I want to do that? Because in their experience, and right again, rightfully so, in their experience, they've been penalized or penalized for that in the past. And so we really have to look at what message we're sending about where this lies.
Yeah.
Um, I have seen a lot of success with the position of accessibility director because
Mhm.
that can encompass do we have accessible hiring practices? Do
Yeah.
we have accessible onboarding? Are there pathways to leadership for people? Is the company accessible for an employee to move up? And how do we make it accessible?
Yeah.
And inclusive of that? How do we design it so it automatically is part of the system or the
Yeah,
structure.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And that can also open up to like financial access, right? So many things that kind of justifies, I mean, I don't want to say justify, obviously the position is justified, but
Yeah,
harder to eliminate maybe in a corporate reorg or, department evaluations and things like that, because
yeah.
it can fit in anywhere when you talk about accessibility. And what you said around HR and the distrust, that's so interesting. I think only recently there was and I somebody shared this on LinkedIn thinking that it was like a joke, but then it wasn't. A company sent out a survey to employees, wanting them to share their stress levels. And all the employees who share that they're extremely stressed, they got laid off.
Are you kidding me?
I thought it was a joke. I thought it was like dark humor. And then the person reshared it saying like, I fact checked it. This is true.
How is that legal?
I don't even know. Like, and it's so like, seeing what's happening in the tech world these days and like mass layoffs and things like that. There's this like toxic trend that's happening right now, which I'm hoping and assuming it's only temporary because this can't sustain. Like you can't continue to treat people and then expect trust and loyalty and commitment from your teams in the future. This just gives bad image to this, and this is going back to our conversations around inclusion is just good practice and it resonates with everybody. When people see their companies or institutions are inclusive of people who have historically been not included, I think it makes feel everyone safe. And so once you see
Yeah,
like mass layoffs and something like that, why would anybody else go for HR for anything?
you
And
wouldn't.
you wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
Yeah.
And that is, therein lies one of the challenges. But it really goes back to communications. I mean, if we want to build trust, we
Yeah.
have to have transparency and communication. And that comes to, again, going back to aligning internal and external messaging. Um, and then also helping people better understand interpersonal communication. And I
Yeah.
often call it, it's like the missing middle. Middle
Oh my
managers
God.
are so um, like sandwiched between, leadership, C-suite execs, and frontline, and it's like they're bombarded with information, but
Yeah.
how many resources are we giving to people? Because if you think about how managers become managers, the majority of them were really wonderful at their job. And in order to promote and earn more money and all of those things, they have to go into management. There's no other track for them. And
Yeah.
so we have people with no administrative training or background coming into these positions and being sandwiched between these two and not knowing how to bridge that gap or negotiate that gap and the communications that needs to happen between the two.
Mm.
And so that also goes back to communications, right?
I
And
know. It's just the answer.
well,
Okay, can we
it
just call the
is.
podcast that? Like,
What's
communication is
wrong
better.
with communications, right? And
I
it's
know.
true. It's true. And there's a misunderstanding about how to report out or communicate about social cause and the work that you're doing and
Yeah.
messaging it in a way that, going back to what I said earlier, you're taking people on that journey with you. Like we're
Yeah.
not going to do it today, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but the public and internally can transparently know that the work is happening.
Yeah.
Um, and I
Or we
wonder how
aim to
that will
do
be
this
impacted.
and we're aiming to start
Yes.
off with this, right? Like, I don't know, like, to your earlier point, like, is it because if you say more, you committed to more, therefore legal tells you don't say more, but then at the same time, you're kind of like, well, we need to say something. So how about we just say for all? And it's not for all either. So isn't that worse?
It's,
So it's just,
yeah.
um,
It's interesting what you say about that too, because going back to creating safe spaces and like psychologically safe spaces. So I had a client and we put together a year-long program or campaign to really shift culture through education. So we had a very specific training workshop webinar every month for a year. And we looked at, where we started with attendance and where we ended up, which was wild. I mean,
Amazing.
after the first one, they had to increase openings of LinkedIn from 500 to 1,000. Then they had to open that up. So it just like was a fire. It just caught on to the whole business. It was fantastic. But what happened was about our 10th, maybe our 10th one, we had some HR folks and some legal folks in there, which I love HR, I love legal. They are part of the process of getting
Yeah.
these, across the finish line. But there are also some barriers that are presented. And one of the things that was brought up to us was we have all of these people, which it was incredible. I'm just going to tell you, it was incredible. The amount of people in the chat who were sharing their diagnoses, sharing that maybe they have a
Wow.
child with a disability, like getting together on things like, oh, you were
Yeah.
diagnosed too. Like, I was diagnosed late with, whatever it may be. And so these conversations started. And by like the third one, the chat was on fire. I don't know why I keep using that term, but like it
Yeah.
was just amazing. And so after the 10th one, we're brought into this meeting about, well, having people disclose increases opportunities for bias on behalf of managers, leaders, all types of
Mm.
folks.
Yeah.
And so they were like, we don't want people to, be sharing that much. Well, what I
Mm.
said was, we've created a safe space, and that should be applauded. The fact that we were able to create this space for people where they felt comfortable in the chat sharing. And now you're saying this over here, which if we remove that, we're telling people you can't trust us. If we say,
Exactly.
don't
Exactly.
share, don't converse with people, don't meet other people in your community. Now we're saying, no, we don't want this psychologically safe environment. Don't share. So it's like, well, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
Do you
So
want us to build
interesting.
this? And if so, this is how we need to. And if not, how do you want us to design it so it works for the
Yeah.
business and the individuals? And I'm open to that.
Yeah.
But what would that look like?
Oh
I
yeah, do
think
you want to be
that's
inclusive or not? It's just, but like it's a great example of showing the gap between infrastructural readiness, right, for what they really want, right? Because then, yes, if you don't trust your own leadership, why would your employees ever trust you? And then you're like creating the safe space for the employees and suddenly being ready, oh, wait, don't. And also a great example of how you communicate without even saying anything. Like you're not saying it like don't trust the leadership, but you're actually saying it, by
your
not allowing.
actions. Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
fascinating. And yeah, that's I think also how we kind of set people up to fail in mid-level management, even like in DEI
Yeah.
departments, like chief DEI officers. I know like at least two chief DEI officers who quit their jobs in like under a year because they felt that they were like hitting walls, right? And the how the organization is designed is not necessarily ready to have that leader there because that leader is not listened to maybe
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think again, when we were saying kind of the internal reflection or am I ready, this also I guess applies for like companies too. Like, right? Like where are we now? Like let's diagnose our
Yes.
positionality first as an organization. So if there is bias that we need to address, maybe let's address that first before trying to generate like a safe space for employees and then,
Exactly.
have them even more distrustful, like become more distrustful or angry because they opened up and now they're being penalized for that. So I think it's
Yeah.
extremely
Yeah.
like self-reflection, like everything starts with knowing yourself, right? Like it's like you before marrying someone, you should better know yourself. Like it's kind of like
Right?
yeah,
I'm like, before buying plants, I should better know my strengths
exactly.
and where those
So
lie.
it's so fascinating, isn't it? Where like such complex problems in the world, from like in accessibility and inclusion to sustainability and like things in AI, a lot of the challenges boil down to very, very human things. And if not like we can, I think, have a very strong hypothesis that one of the reasons why we're seeing these symptoms in every space is poor or miscommunication, right? Like it just, it's so, and I think that's like when I also get frustrated in like designer centric design or like tech as the savior, right? Like, no,
Oh
like
my
a lot
gosh.
of the challenges are very human, and let's maybe address those human things first, and let's reflect on our own, like where we are at, right? Who are we? What are we doing? Let's just reflect a little bit and then think how we're going to communicate about it. Um,
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that I think one of the challenges we have as leaders is understanding and recognizing that we are still learning and unlearning as well. And so it's important and critical that we check our ego and our pride at the door and we really
yeah,
enter into these conversations in a way that we want to learn. Because as you were talking about the leadership and the work internally that's being done, if the leaders aren't aware of the work that's being done, there's no way to move or convince them that they should
yeah,
talk about it because they haven't been part of the conversation. And so sometimes I think we're missing the buy-in from all of the leadership. So while there's a position that was created,
yeah,
why? Why do we have
yeah,
this position and how effective do you want this individual to be?
yeah,
Or are you just hiring someone for perception and
yeah,
that's kind of what you're thinking? But there again, I think it's incredible that really we've gone back to even the top five that I shared with you really all rely on communications and miscommunication or non-transparent communication or lack of information,
yeah,
for some of the sponsors or leaders. It really goes back to that human piece, and that human piece is really us. I would say to people, I
yeah,
said to one group that I was training, I said, listen, I can train you all day and we can do this workshop and we can go through interactive processes. But at the end of the day, you're the one that shows up for work every day, or you're the one that shows up for your clients or your whoever.
yeah,
You're that person. So how you show up is what's important. Did you get into a fender bender? Did you get it pulled over and get a ticket? Did you spill your coffee all over your pants and now you're
yeah,
irritated about that? Like, it's these
yeah,
little things. And if we don't have that self-awareness to say, okay, this is this is really not that big of a deal. I need to focus on helping and set that aside, because that shouldn't play into our conversations with people. I was sharing
exactly.
with a colleague that really at the end of each day, I try to figure out, just have I been kind? Did I say hello to the janitor that was in the bathroom? And did I say thank you for keeping that clean for us? Because that's really important. Or did I say hello and thank somebody at the hotel I was staying at that does the buffet and picks up with no tip, no thank you? Did I smile and say good morning? Was I rude to someone and yeah, I was. Can I do better tomorrow? But I think if we could all just take a more of a look at ourselves and how
Yeah,
we're presenting, we could look more at that human design. I had a young woman, and I think that's maybe pie in the sky as to what people would say. I had a young woman I was meeting with the other day, just an informational kind of interview. And she said to me, "Well, why wouldn't they do this work? It's the right thing to do." And I was like, "Oh, I love you. I used to think that."
You're like, now, where should I start?
Right? And I was like, yeah, I love that, but let's think about what's the ROI for them.
Yeah.
How does it hit their bottom line? If we're thinking about designing a whole different structure or system for people, even if we understand that it's the structure and system that disables someone, even if we understand that, are there enough of them here? Are there enough people with
Yeah.
disabilities um, for me to get a return on my investment? If I hire someone, what's the turnaround going to be? Am I going to have to replace that person? So I think there are all of these things that we think about from a human perspective and the fiscal perspective. Well, and I always say it's fiscal and human resources, and how do we align
Yeah.
those two? Um,
Yeah.
and do the best we can for everyone, really. And it's also about leaders saying, hey, maybe I didn't do this right in the past, and saying to people, yeah, we didn't do this. We failed you.
I
And
know. Just
we
start with that.
recognize that, yeah, we
Because
failed
we
you,
all did, man. Like,
and we recognize that.
yeah.
And here's how, and we want to bring you all from this, like this podcast. We want to bring people
Yeah.
from a point of frustration and get out of that kind of cesspool of the negativity. And how do we bring
Yeah.
people to more solution oriented conversations? So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Like, it's kind of venting and ranting is kind of like therapy, but if it's only that, it's not productive. So like you
it's
need
not
to kind of
productive.
evolve into, and then you can have your like occasional venting with your selected group, which is necessary.
Exactly. Your selected group. I like that.
I call it my mental health support group. Anybody in the
I love
innovation
that.
space or like working on mission driven stuff, it's not easy. So you need your support group.
No.
And I
Oh
tell
my
that to my
gosh.
students too, like find your people, it's so important.
I
I
might have to
think
crash one of your mental health groups sometime.
please
I could
always
use it. I could use it.
we call it group therapy. That's good.
Yeah, I love Yeah, it's so important too, right? In this workspace. One of the things that I know we talk about, or you talk about on the podcast, like for future leaders, like some
Yeah.
advice that I would give, um, is that this is social cause work. And sometimes people want to pay you nothing because they feel like you should do this work out of the goodness of your heart. Please don't perpetuate not
Oh my
paying
God.
disabled people. So demand your value in this space, and also understand that just because it is social cause work, like we just said, you have to find out the data. And how I approach it, because I also come from academic background and research and data, is I produce a research paper. So what's my hypothesis, right? My hypothesis is that communications is a struggle bus in corporations, and I need to find the data that supports how we can create a more accessible communications design.
Exactly.
Like things like that. I recognize it doesn't feel great to have to change your verbiage and what you want to say, but that's how we're going to get work done and make change in the space. Also,
Yeah.
like reach out to people doing this work and learn about the landscape. One of the things that so I have an angry podcast, and it was just lasted 1 year, and 12 episodes in 2021, and it's just all anger, and it
I
doesn't
love
know.
Is it called the Angry Podcast?
It was called the funniest name. Include this, but it should have been like include this, like more anger and like laying it out there. But I haven't done it, and 2021 was it. That's the only season it ever had, and then I haven't figured out what it wants to be when it grows up, because now I've aligned, and I'm not angry. And I'm like, well, I mean, I still, you know what I mean. So,
Yeah.
what I think is important is that sometimes we work in a silo
Mm.
in this area. And I think it's really important to reach out to people who are already doing this work and learn about the landscape. Because once you know, it's just like a company or corporation, right? Like once you
Yeah.
know where you're at now, and once you understand where um, corporate America, nonprofits, government agencies are standing on these things, and you know that, you're able to determine and identify niches or areas, access points where you can come in and make an impact. But without knowing that landscape,
100%.
I was just angry on my podcast, right? So
I
that's
love that as a quote.
just an angry podcast. And I work with a lot of women with chronic conditions, and they're also angry, And so, like, the one thing that they always say is, am I disabled enough? Like, and I said, yeah, that's my question. I made a podcast about it, Well, I was angry too. And so it's, how do we share this knowledge and really also um, help people with disabilities advocate for themselves as well in these spaces. So our work at eye level is twofold. So working directly with the corporations, but also directly with the people with disabilities through
Mm,
coaching and mentoring, specifically women with chronic conditions, because that's what I know, because that's who I am. So figure out, like, for me, the chronic conditions piece is where I've identified that we need to address this piece,
yeah,
because as women, we're being overlooked.
yeah,
Our experiences are being overlooked. Inequitable healthcare, inequitable workplaces, inequitable in every way. And the other thing I want to say to young leaders is remember that the change is slow and incremental, and that can be painful for a lot of us. But we all need to recognize that no matter how many hours we work in a day or put in a week,
yeah.
that the work is still going to be here, and the fight will continue because it's been a fight for decades. And so we will continue that fight. And it's like the seven habits of highly effective people. I love this one where we're the golden goose, right? And so in
Yeah.
order for us to lay golden eggs, we have to take care of ourselves as that golden goose and find that
So well
balance
said.
between our personal and professional lives, because for me, it's so intertwined. So when I leave work, I'm still talking with women with chronic conditions. I'm still volunteering, to lead an emerging leaders alliance for the MS Society. So I'm still in it, even when I
Yeah.
leave work at the end of the day. So how do we avoid burnout and use rest as a tool for resistance in this space? Um, those would be my top three pieces of advice.
Oh my God. Love all of the above. And they're so, I think, universally helpful for anyone, really. So it's so special. And as suspected, I can talk to you all day, Sarah.
I know. I
This is a
know.
one.
It's been an hour.
Thank you so, so much. This was so amazing.
That was
I
wonderful.
encourage everyone to like follow Sarah's work, just reach out to her, stay in touch, and I guess learn from her ways too. And listen to her angry podcast. I love I love that, like this is, like some days you want to listen to like an angry song because that's that kind of a day. So turn on that podcast if you're having one of those days. Good day.
100%. And it's also really good for people who are learning about disability, because it sheds a lot of light on my own journey of
Yeah.
understanding and learning more about how how we do this work, but how we do this work staying true to ourselves and our experiences and our integrity and all of that. Yeah. I do love this work. I do.
And it shows. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Sarah.
I appreciate you so much. I love it, and I can't wait to crash your mental health group.
Thank you so, so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.